Hey guys, I've created this video as the very first entry in my long-form manga analysis/review channel. This is my first time doing this kind of thing in terms of creating content for discussion, and I hope it fares well in relation to its subject, and today its subject being Claymore. I do want to point out that a large portion of this video is going to contain spoilers, as I get pretty in-depth and analyze specific characters and events in the manga. I will point out that spoilers section when we get to it. With Claymore being a manga that is commonly referred to as Berserk's younger sister, I had very high hopes going into it. Not only that, but Berserk being the manga that I read previous to this one, and also my first manga, Claymore had some seriously high expectations to meet. Claymore is actually a really great manga that I ended up liking a lot. Though at the beginning, I was actually considering giving it up around 20 chapters in. I think a lot of it had to do with that sense of super high expectations and standards, having only read Berserk before this and hearing people say that they're similar, hence the Berserk's younger sister. After finishing it, I would say that it's a fitting title. Definitely not in terms of character depth, but maybe just in the stylistic choices in the art and the setting. There are for sure some good character moments that are deep and personal and profound, which kind of remind me of Berserk in a way, but not only that, there are also some particular elements to the art that are no doubt directly inspired by Berserk, which I'll get into later. We start off with getting to know Claire, the main character of Claymore. Claire initially comes off as a mysterious, cold, brooding warrior type with no apparent personality traits or interests outside of killing Yoma, which is her job. In the first few chapters, we're also introduced to Rocky, a small village kid who Claire saves the life of. Rocky immediately has an interest in Claire, which eventually develops into a savior complex. He follows her around and basically serves as a means to open up Claire's personality a bit. Honestly, like a lot of other readers, I found Rocky really annoying for some reason. I think the character trope of the whining kid that refuses to leave the side of their savior is really obviously utilized here, and it doesn't really help that he has no other traits whatsoever. Eventually, I did end up liking Rocky a lot more. It just took a long time and a lot of plot context to get any development out of him, though it definitely happens in a strong way when it does. After some time, we're shown Claire's backstory, which actually has strikingly similar exposition elements to the intro of the manga, except this time the entire thing feels so much more genuine. This is the point where Claire, in her youth, takes a similar role to Rocky in the beginning of the story, but here it seems much more interesting. The fact that we already know that Claire becomes a Claymore, paired with the interest of wanting to know more about our mysteriously presented protagonist, makes this backstory very interesting. Teresa is also a fantastic character, which goes through a lot of personal development in such a short amount of time, especially considering we don't know much about her own life. It's really well done and it's very touching. I think this point in the story really opens up the believability and pushes intrigue for the individuality of each Claymore, which is an aspect of the story that progresses very well from this point. Around the beginning of the two-third points of Claymore is where I think it takes a huge upward leap from an already steady increase in quality. The cast is increased significantly, and some of the best and my favorite characters in the story are given a lot more focus. The level of detail in the art style seemingly becomes much higher here, and so does the intensity and amount of meaningful dialogue. An important climax is reached at the story in this point, which serves only to drastically open up the scale of the world. Really great reveals and twists are unfolded here that are built up from very early on. The bonding and interpersonal relationships between the Claymore are highly expanded and explored here as well, which is really satisfying. From this point onward, I was totally hooked. The intrigue in the world that has been built up snowballs considerably, and new concepts are introduced which continue to build onto the lore even more as the story goes on. As the sense of power these characters hold escalates, the concepts used to fuel the art and design goes from fairly standard to absolutely insane. They really cross the threshold of fantasy to dark fantasy and even horror in a very confident way. Norihiko Yagi, and forgive me if I'm pronouncing that wrong, his illustrations really exemplify a blend of truly godlike beauty and horrifying otherworldly elements. And the character designs that show up later in the manga have become some of my favorite of all time. This escalation of intensity in the art style eventually completely changes the mood of the battles to feeling much more deadly over time. For probably close to half of the total panels in the manga, the reader spends a lot of time traversing these fast-paced battles. What Claymore definitely does right is the extreme sense of speed that the artwork conveys. Speed is the defining factor of strength and victory when it comes to these battles, and this is even referred to in some character dialogue later on. The lightning speed pacing of these scenes is really solid, and as intended, has the reader regularly saying, "What the hell just happened?" much like the characters in the story themselves. The way that combat is kept interesting in Claymore is handled superbly, as it directly ties into the unique fighting style of each character. This is presented clearly in the titling system of the names of the various Claymore: Phantom Miria, Quicksword Eilina, Teresa of the Faint Smile, etc. These range from simple techniques focusing on extreme speed and strength to more innate abilities which certain Claymore possess, an example being God Eye Galatea, to fighting techniques that are more of a unique variety. One of the most notable, in my opinion, was Dust Eater Cassandra, who utilizes a very bizarre fighting style. Her introduction and backstory provides a lot of depth to the titling system of the Claymore. Speaking in terms of the art, I find a lot of similarities between Yagi's art style and the art style of Kentaro Miura, the creator of Berserk. Not so much in the design of the Claymore and human characters, but as I mentioned before, this is mostly in the character design of the awakened beings. I don't think I'm the first one to make this comparison either. Some scenes and characters in particular seem to be not only heavily influenced by Berserk, but possibly even purposeful nods to the series. I first noticed this in chapter 66 with a beautiful set of panels depicting a lower level claymore finding a large gathering of claymore blades sticking up out of the ground in a field of snow. This seemed like a direct reference to the Hill of Swords in Berserk, and the imagery and context to the setting is very similar. The design of Isley's awakened form also really reminded me of Berserk's Locus, an apostle knight with a centaur-like design. This is also the same case with Octavia, the abyssal one, whose awakened form is extremely similar to the character Irvine, another apostle knight in Berserk. This one seems even more heavily influenced, since their centaur-like design has the human half of the body resting on the back legs of the creature half, which struck me as really uncommon. There are even more examples of this similarity throughout the manga, but these were the ones that stood out to me. There is clearly a lot of Berserk influence floating to the surface of these designs. Not to say there aren't plenty of very original designs in Claymore, there definitely are. Sometimes the plot and events do tend to over explain themselves, and dialogue can be a bit redundant to what's already being shown to the reader. I'm the kind of person who really appreciates subtlety and needing to piece things together contextually, and even reading between the lines to understand what's going on in the plot. That was something that took me out of the story a bit at first, which is just a personal thing. To its credit, the overarching plot line of the story does become increasingly complex and definitely requires a bit of exposition over time. This is especially true because of the sheer number of characters, whether in focus or not, whose involvement in the story often needs to be explained in a relatively short amount of time. There are 155 chapters in Claymore, and I think it had the potential to easily be twice as long, which I would be perfectly happy with, since it would likely have been utilized to explore each character to the fullest extent that they fully deserve. Getting to know the many, many silver-eyed warriors in this world is probably the most interesting aspect of the story of Claymore. I think the desire to see even more characters built upon or explored than there already are really speaks to the level of quality and emotionality to that aspect of the story. Overall, I would have liked more attention on Claire as the main character, as after a certain point, the focus drops away from Claire and further towards the overarching plot progression. Instead of the story continuing to have a single main character, all of the other main characters and their actions are given an equal amount of priority. Earlier in the story, there are a good amount of scenes which consist of one-on-one dialogue with Claire, and even some of Claire's own thoughts and feelings are brought to the forefront as her own personal introspection. I do enjoy Claire, and obviously I was rooting for her and her personal mission throughout the entirety of the story, but I ended up disappointed at a certain point because I eventually didn't feel very close to her. I enjoy a character being explored through introspection. I love to hear the ever-changing thoughts, emotions, philosophies, and observations a character has about the world around them and how they fit into it. At some point, this is lost with Claire, and it's really too bad. I still felt very attached to Claire throughout the story, but I feel like an opportunity to make that attachment even stronger was sadly missed. The story makes up for this by delivering a solid quality to all the other aspects and events that unfold in the latter portions. It's just that shift in focus was somewhat jarring to me. An introspection heavy, deep, and philosophical stance isn't to be expected in most shonen manga, but since Claymore does deliver on this front in such a well executed way from time to time, it gives me the impression that it borders somewhere between shonen and seinen as a whole, which is why I would recommend Claymore as a great read for fans of both classifications. The ending of Claymore was very sweet, very beautiful, and very well thought out. Everything that goes on in the last few chapters is extremely dramatic and heartfelt. I think the art quality goes way up here with some very breathtaking and detailed two-page spreads, which I'm a huge fan of. Overall, the finale of Claymore gifts the reader with a beautiful closure and some very emotional moments that really feel so authentic for each character. The story is tied together near perfectly, with very little loose ends to speak of. The lore of the world of Claymore is explored to its fullest extent in the final few chapters, following through from what pieces of mystery to the world are alluded to throughout the latter half of the manga. I would say Claymore had a very fitting end to its journey, which mirrored its overarching focus on power, humanity, loyalty, kinship, and sacrifice. Claymore was a great read for me that I ended up growing very attached to. I would absolutely recommend it to anyone who's looking for a solid, dark fantasy world to get enveloped in, with so many great characters to get to know. Alright, so with that being said, I will get into the spoilers section now. Here's where I'd like to point out some of my own personal letdowns and high moments while reading Claymore, as well as points in the manga which I found most interesting. Specifically, this has a lot to do with a lot of my favorite characters and how the large amount of characters and events were handled in the story. So, if you haven't read it and you care about spoilers, definitely stop the video now. So, the climactic halfway point I was referring to earlier is, of course, the Battle of the North. This story completely ramps up here as we see the highest number of Claymore in one place to this point, and the most single digit Claymore. We're reintroduced to Miria, Helen, and Denevy here as well, who have solidified their roles as some of the most important characters in the story. Not only that, but the chemistry between these three and Claire is always so convincing and entertaining. I absolutely love Helen in particular for being basically the only light-hearted, easygoing Claymore. Her carefree attitude and tendency to jest at and mess with her peers just for fun comes at a huge relief to the usual serious dispositions. Denevy comes off as having a more serious and cordial attitude from the start, which eventually cracks and is broken down by her interactions with Helen, revealing a very friendly yet bashful personality which is very admirable. Helen and Denevy are a perfect duo, as their personalities feed off each other very nicely. At this point, it's incredibly clear that Miria plays a huge and important role in the story, and she fills her position so well. She carries such a convincing attitude of urgency and seriousness to fulfill her goals and duties. Miria is very compassionate and accepting towards her fellow Claymore, and very open minded to utilize her intuition whenever possible. This is clear as Miria grows closer to Claire and senses that she has an intense potential regardless of her low rank. She plays the role of a kind-hearted leader who will go to great lengths to protect her comrades. This goes as far as being a serious fault of hers, as she puts herself in extreme unnecessary risk for the sake of keeping others out of harm's way. Regardless, this only adds to the depth of her character, and I grew very fond of Miria over time. One character that really caught my interest right away and became a short lived favorite was Undine. Undine's personality is very obvious from her very first line as she outgoingly boasts her own strength and bravery as she goes on to tell all the other Claymore that if they're scared, they should just leave. She immediately comes off stronger than any other Claymore in terms of the size of her personality. Undine keeps an air of brashness and aggressiveness in such an overbearing way that it almost seems like an overcompensation, especially considering she isn't even a single digit. That, paired with the fact that she has a super muscular physique, which seems unnecessary from what we've been shown in the story so far, this is even spoken about by one of the other Claymore. Oh, and she also carries two swords. That in particular was probably the most striking thing about Undine. She carries two Claymore, one being her own, and the other we find out is the Claymore of a dear fallen friend. This immediately makes Undine a much more interesting Claymore, since her backstory is hinted at in her very design and fighting style. As the battle in Pieta rages onward, we see that Undine only wants to protect those who are weaker than her, in contrast to her outward attitude toward weakness before the battle. The subsequent scenes we're shown with Undine give her character even more depth, even in her last actions in the manga, unfortunately. The Battle of the North is where a lot of things really pop off when it comes to this manga, and there's a lot of high points. The scene in the Battle of the North where Claire has a partial awakening while fighting Rigaldo was definitely a high point in the manga for me. The tension that has been built up around Claire's close calls to accidentally awakening is very thick at this point in the story, since this is something that's happened more than a couple times. The panel that first shows Claire's warped, alien looking awakened legs is so crazy. Seeing Claire cross that threshold and utilizing it in battle in spite of barely being able to control it was super intense. I couldn't help but experience such a sense of dread as Claire's awakening progressed through the fight, which finally leads up to a very powerful moment with Jean essentially saving Claire's life and returning the exact favor that Claire did for her before. I think this is really powerful because the nature of Claire and Jean's relationship really pushes the boundaries of what we've previously learned about the Claymore and their awakening. The entire theme of their interactions reinforces the sense of humanity and individuality in the Claymore, and how powerful that aspect of themselves can be, despite that the opposite is all we've been alluded to for most of the story. Isley was such an interesting character to me, and one of the characters whose personality and design I liked the most. I ended up pretty disappointed in the lack of time that Isley was given in the manga. He definitely served a great role and added so much to the story, and I only say this because I wanted even more of him. He was hyped up to an incredible amount, being one of the very few characters given the title of Abyssal One. His origin also adds so much expectation to his character, as he was the number one most powerful Claymore of the very first generation of Claymore, as well as a male Claymore, which are supposed to be extremely powerful. He was even said to be the very last of his generation to awaken, and he awakened entirely of his own accord to be able to defeat his lost comrades. This insane backstory creates such a high expectation for his character, and it definitely delivers to a degree, but I think it should have been taken even further. Isley's awakened form is my favorite in the manga, and I think it's also just the most striking design of any of the Abyssal ones. His power is absolutely given justice at many points in the story, notably his intense battle with Luciella of the South, in which he defeats her and forces her to retreat, unable to maintain her awakened form. Isley's eventual fate is counterintuitive to the image that has been built up for his character at this point, in my opinion. In his battle with the Abyss Feeders, it's explained that they are very powerful beings created from the remains of awakened beings, and also Isley was still badly injured from his fight with Luciella, but this still seemed like a very unfitting death. The Abyss Feeders were very uninteresting in origin and design to me. I think the story could have been just as good without them, honestly. There were a lot of great characters which could have taken the place of their somewhat rushed feeling addition and benefited from more scene time. Considering Isley had such a strong connection with Priscilla and Rocky, it would have made more sense to have Isley be one of the Abyssal ones which fought alongside the Claymore at the finale of the story. This would have been appropriate with the attitude of his character being much more driven by his own personal feelings more than anything. I think it would have made for a stronger narrative choice if Isley and Priscilla had one last interaction before the final few chapters, and even some dialogue with Rocky or Claire may have tied things together very nicely. Speaking more of the Abyssal ones, personally I didn't find much interest in Refool of the West. She may have been the least interesting Abyssal one of the four regions. Though she plays a big role in the story, her personality is kind of one dimensional, and much like that of a generic Yoma to me. Her cheerful yet empty attitude paired with her over the top evil actions make for a pretty commonplace antagonistic personality type. We also don't get much of Refool's backstory, which would have made her a bit more intriguing. Refool was the very first female Claymore, and she also knows Isley and Doff very well since she was only one generation behind them. The small amount we do know about her past definitely builds interest. Being the very first female Claymore is a big position to fill, exposition wise. Her relationship with Isley also could have been explored more, but unfortunately, there's little to no dialogue that expands on this, besides the fact that they have been rivals in territorial disputes since becoming abyssal ones. Even more unfortunate is how much time is spent on interactions between Refool and Doff. Doff is easily the very worst written character in the entire manga. There's nothing likable about him at all. He serves the role of being Refool's mindless brute, but I would say he encompasses that role a bit too well. Dolph's dialogue basically never expands outside of angry, tantrum like outbursts in battle. This would have been fine for a one off Yoma for the Claymore to fight, but Dolph's position is clearly larger than that in scope. It's plainly stated that Riefel and Dolph are lovers or partners of some kind. As Riefel's backstory is explained, it shows that Dolph is commonly fighting alongside Isley, the most powerful male Claymore of his generation. This suggests that Dolph is extremely powerful himself, and he is, but his character is incredibly dull in comparison. It's shown that Dolph has a strong affinity toward Riefel upon meeting her, even though Riefel is a very young girl. Honestly, Dolph is a total creep for this, and I believe something along those lines is even stated by one of the other characters. Even Riefel finds Dolph abhorrent in their very first interaction, and is quick to let him know that she absolutely despises him. The fact that Riefel and Dolph end up together anyway is a clear indicator that Riefel simply uses Dolph as a means of progressing her goals. It's also stated by Riefel that Dolph is the only one strong enough to accept her without breaking, which I'm guessing implies some kind of sexual relationship, which honestly makes me hate Dolph even more. He sticks around in the story for way too long, considering every interaction with him is the same situation as the first time he's introduced. Now, speaking of actually interesting characters, the storyline between the sister Claymore, Luciella, and Raffaella was touching, intense, and very odd. They end up as being some of the strangest characters in Claymore, in my opinion. Their personal plotline concerning Raffaella seeking to atone for failing her sister and blaming her own weakness as the cause of her awakening hit me pretty deep. The moment that they're finally reunited is incredibly sad and touching. Two siblings finally reunite, just for it to be the very last time they'll ever be together, as Raffaella seemingly fulfills her loyalty to Luciella by killing her. Later in the story, Rieful reveals to have found the fused bodies of Luciella and Raffaella. This is such a shocking and horrifying image, and also just a very confusing turn of events as nothing like this has been presented before, especially with the information given by Rieful that the sisters are both somehow still alive in some way. The nature of the Claymore and awakening becomes even more mysterious and alien due to this. The following metamorphosis that they undergo as the story goes on continues down the path of obscurity, not even the other Claymore or the organization fully understanding it. Claire finds Raffaella and Luciella and enters their minds in some kind of psychic link dream and is also literally absorbed into their form. In their mind, Claire has to kill Raffaella and also receives some very important information from her. This reaches an insane climax with the awakening of the merged Luciella and Raffaella. They take the form of a massive, monolithic creature hundreds of meters tall and given the title the Destroyer. This statuesque tower of a creature is able to shoot giant rods from its body, which gains some kind of sentience and take form similar to Luciella's original awakened form. The scope of this transformation is the most extreme example of an awakening shown yet, and really gives the sense that, in the creation of the Claymore, the organization have truly harnessed the power of something akin to a god. This is absolutely wild storytelling and is an incredibly solid section of the manga. The introduction of Alicia and Beth was absolutely solid. The idea of two sister Claymore using a soul link is explored here again, as it was in the backstory of Luciella and Raffaella. The difference explained here is that Alicia and Beth are not only sisters, but twins. This makes the link between them much more powerful and thus making their technique actually attainable. The goal of this relationship is that one twin can fully awaken as the other concentrates on their link so their humanity is not totally lost during a full awakening. This also makes it possible for them to completely return from their awakening with no consequence. The design of the twins Alicia and Beth are immediately very striking. They're referred to as Alicia and Beth the Black due to their all black Claymore armor, which looks really awesome. One of the very first panels of their introduction shows Alicia's awakened form, which is a very intense illustration. Her design in particular reminded me of something like an H.R. Geiger painting. She has long, black, blade like appendages coming from her warped limbs and head. She retains her all black armor, which stretches over her awakened form and is somehow not destroyed. This makes for a very unique and fantastic design. For some reason, Alicia and Beth's relationship really stood out to me. The reality of the situations that the organization places these young girls in is horrifying. It's explained that Alicia and Beth were conditioned their entire lives to be stoic, cold, and unthinking beings, more so than the average Claymore. This is so that their soul link technique can be focused and attained without interference from their thoughts and emotions from their human side. It's initially shown that the organization was very successful in the conditioning of these girls, and that they have created a pair of perfect killing machines to obey their every order. Later in the story, an awakened Alicia is fighting against Riefel when she senses that Beth is in danger. Alicia immediately rushes to her sister's side, abandoning her current orders given by the organization. This moment illustrates that, in spite of being raised to having no true sense of self, Alicia and Beth very much have a deep personal and emotional bond to one another. I think that once this is established, the subsequent scenes involving Alicia and Beth take a much darker tone and can even be described as heart wrenching. These are simply young girls whose lives have essentially been taken away. When it comes down to it, the Claymore are human beings who have been terribly taken advantage of. I liked when this idea of the soul link technique was doubled down on yet again later in the story with the addition of the unnamed twins during the battle against the organization. The very draconian appearance of their awakened forms is also fantastic. The soul link is explored yet again in the story with the introduction of Miata, another one of my favorite Claymore. Miata is a very young Claymore, which the organization deem unstable. Rightly so, as Miata has an incredible amount of power, which she is clearly not fit to wield, considering her young age. It is even said that her power likely surpasses that of all the previous number ones, yet she is ranked at number 4 of her generation due to her mental instability. Miata is extremely reminiscent of Priscilla in the sense that they were both extremely young Claymore with incredible amounts of power. The design of her long, hip length hair suggests that she may have been neglected for some time, either due to others fearing and avoiding her, or due to being alone after losing her caretakers. Her dialogue is mostly limited to allusions of her backstory, specifically regarding her parents, which she most likely did lose in some traumatizing event, as is the case with most Claymore. Eventually, Miata meets Clarice and instinctively forms a daughter mother type bond with her, even seeming to believe that Clarice is her actual mother. This is sadly a strong example of her warped psyche. Regardless, the bond between Miata and Clarice becomes so strong that Clarice is instructed to attempt a soul link with Miata during one of the final battles. Miata's awakened form is absolutely insane, as one would expect. I was very curious as to her awakening, given her already berserker style of fighting power. Her awakened form resembles a gigantic feather winged serpent, which is one of the largest awakened forms in the manga. Her design is striking and honestly beautiful. I would go as far as saying the illustrations of Awakened Miata even invoke a sense of divinity. This is a consistent feeling that I experienced throughout the manga, but especially here. I grew a great appreciation for Rocky post time skip. In his introduction, he comes off as a totally one dimensional, whining kid with a typical backstory for his setting. After his time spent with Isley and Priscilla, and after the 7 year skip, we find a much more mature version of Rocky, which is immediately more likable. Suddenly, his one track mindset of finding Claire and protecting her is not only tolerable but admirable. I think this is because we see now that his attachment towards Claire isn't just something that a child with no other place to go has latched onto only by instinct, but it's a true connection and desire for someone who means so much to him, even after all this time. The simplicity of his resolve remaining unchanged is refreshing as the story becomes so complex at the point of his reintroduction. It's nice to see a character which has a singular goal of just to see his friend again. There isn't anything that goes further than that in Rocky's mind, and he accepts this as truth with confidence. Claire and Rocky's reunion is a serious tearjerker and is handled beautifully. I also loved Rocky's role in the finale, which really delivers on aspects that I was previously let down on. I loved that he was willing to be wounded by Priscilla in order to assist in her defeat in the end. The fact that this was the main reason that Isley trained Rocky during their time together, and that Isley's instruction to Rocky was able to be achieved exactly as it was planned, was an incredible callback to Isley's character. Not to mention that this was a huge twist, as none of this is shown to the reader at all. The level of emotionality here is strong as well, since Rocky had such a strong affinity and relation to Priscilla after spending so much time with her. Rocky saw himself in Priscilla's disorientation and pain, taking part in her defeat, definitely took a lot of strength on Rocky's part and was a very honorable act of mercy and loyalty. The very ending of Claymore was absolutely gorgeous. The battle between Priscilla and Reeful, with the observation and commentary between Rubel and Day, was very revealing to the organization's goals and general nature of somewhat blind experimentation. Priscilla seems to be evenly matched in her battle with Reeful before finally destroying her with a claymore that comes from her body. There's some dialogue from Priscilla as to why she kept her claymore, stating that instead of this decision being based in a personal attachment, it was merely a whim. The awakened Priscilla commonly states that she does things simply on a whim, when in fact this is hinted at being traces of her human consciousness seeping out into her actions. It's implied that Priscilla's possession of her claymore was the result of an attempted suicide. This is extremely believable at this point, as we've seen Priscilla in extreme distress of her very existence, especially in her human form. There's an air of sadness in Priscilla's extreme power and desire to battle with strong opponents, suggesting that she subconsciously seeks out powerful enemies in hopes to be killed by them. This is suggested even more with Day's theory of Priscilla's psychic block against young girls. He states that Priscilla has never preyed upon young girls, and this is a result of the last actions taken by her human mind, which created a psychic block in her awakened mind, which prevented her from even seeing young girls at all on a conscious level, presumably in hopes that one of these spared young girls may grow up to be a claymore for her to be slain by. There's a deep sense of sadness in Priscilla's final scenes, as she battles against the Abyssal Ones and Claymore which seek to destroy her. It's clear that even some of the most powerful beings in the world are still no match for her seemingly infinite energy. Priscilla's final battle with Teresa served as an extremely emotional climax and a perfect expression of Priscilla's character. As Priscilla is overpowered by Teresa, her human consciousness is brought to the surface. In her human form, Priscilla expresses her desperation and begs Teresa to kill her. Priscilla's pain and desire to die is clearly expressed here as being the sole driving force behind her actions as an awakened being. With tears in her eyes, she asks Teresa if it's even possible for her life to be truly ended, gazing up at who seems to be her only hope of salvation from existence. This is such a powerful expression of the intense existential dread and confusion that Priscilla must have been living with for so long. Before being killed, Priscilla asked Teresa why she didn't destroy her earlier in the battle, despite being more than capable. Teresa confesses that she wanted to draw out her human form because she understands how it feels to be killed without knowing what's happening. She didn't want Priscilla to experience that as she did. This act of kindness and mercy says a lot about Teresa's character. With love and maturity, she understood that Priscilla wasn't truly to blame for her death. She couldn't hold a grudge against the young girl who lost control of the power she was cursed to hold. I have a deep admiration for Priscilla, an antagonist who is so vicious and powerful, yet retains her human characteristics. She's a great, well rounded character, given her role in Claymore, and in my opinion, one of the best antagonists ever written. Claire's awakening was a twist that I only saw coming immediately beforehand. Her awakening to literally becoming Teresa was beautiful in a personal sense and also in its design. The idea that Teresa has always existed within Claire as her body was placed into her comes to full fruition in this excellent climax. I love the simplicity of Teresa's design, depicted just as she existed as a claymore, but with four large angelic wings on her back. There are some gorgeous, detailed illustrations in her last few moments, which perfectly convey a sense of beauty and relief. The dialogue between Teresa and Claire is incredibly touching, as Claire finally gets closure and some semblance of acceptance in Teresa's death, which is the major theme of the ending of Claymore: acceptance and beauty in death. Claire's awakening to Teresa's winged form bears an incredible similarity to the twin goddess statue shown earlier in the story. The goddesses depicted in the statue are even named Teresa and Claire. Realizing that this foreshadowing was set up so far in advance was a great connection to make and instills a sense of fulfilled destiny and solidification of the storyline. I think it would have been interesting to see a design which resembled characteristics of both Claire and Teresa occupying the same form to really drive the idea of their connection, but I still love the touching presentation of Teresa that we were given in the end. Teresa takes the archetypal role of the mother, and in her forgiveness and care at the end of the story, this is perfectly expressed. And that about sums up everything I found super notable about Claymore. There's a lot to talk about when it comes to Claymore because there's a lot to Claymore. Did as much of this manga stand out to you guys as it did for me? Maybe you feel differently about some of the characters mentioned, or maybe you agree with a lot of these opinions. Any thoughts or feelings to add to any of this at all would be greatly appreciated down in the comments. I'm absolutely always up for discussion. Any criticisms of the video itself or my writing in general would also be great to hear, as I'm just starting out. If you like this sort of thing, consider subscribing because I plan to continue doing many more videos like this in the future. Thanks again for watching.